deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where morning mist clings to ancient peaks like forgotten secrets. 17-year-old Jake Morrison clutched a crumpled dollar bill and a rusty key. The fraternity boys from the state university had laughed until their sides hurt, selling him what they called the most worthless shack in West Virginia for pocket change. They saw a poor mountain kid with dirt under his fingernails and patches on his jeans. They didn't know Jake's grandfather had been the most successful moonshiner in 3 counties, or that Jake had inherited more than just his weathered hands and sharp mind. As Jake pushed open the cabin door, the floorboards groaned under his boots. Dust particles danced in the afternoon light streaming through broken windows. But something was wrong. The measurements didn't match. The cabin was bigger inside than outside, way bigger. When Jake pried up that loose floorboard in the corner, what he found wasn't just hidden treasure, it was evidence of a secret that powerful people had killed to protect. But here's the question that will haunt you. What happens when the most dangerous family in the mountains discovers their greatest secret is now in the hands of a boy they underestimated? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake had walked 3 miles through dense forest to reach this place, following a hand-drawn map one of the college boys had mockingly sketched on a napkin. They'd been drinking at Murphy's Diner in town, loud and obnoxious, flashing money like peacocks showing feathers. When they'd spotted Jake counting out quarters for a cup of coffee, their entertainment for the evening had been decided. "Hey, mountain boy," the ringleader had called out, a thick-necked kid named Brad Whitmore, whose father owned half the coal mines in the county. "Want to make a real estate investment?" The others had snickered, pulling out their phones to record what they thought would be a humiliating prank. They'd told Jake about a cabin their fraternity had inherited from some old codger who died owing them money. Worthless land, they claimed, not even worth the taxes. $1, Brad had announced grandly. "And it's all yours, Hillbilly Joe." Jake had wanted to walk away. Pride demanded it. But something in their eagerness to get rid of the property had sparked his curiosity. His grandfather had always taught him that when folks were too eager to sell, there was usually more to the story. Now, standing in the impossible space of the cabin, Jake understood why his grandfather's lessons had stuck. The exterior walls suggested a single room, maybe 12 by 12 feet, but inside, the cabin stretched back at least 30 feet. With a high-vaulted ceiling that shouldn't have existed given the low roofline he'd observed from outside. Jake pulled out his phone's flashlight and began a methodical exploration. The walls were lined with what looked like original chestnut paneling, worth a fortune if authentic. Hand-hewn beams crossed overhead, their surfaces bearing the distinctive marks of 19th-century craftsmanship. This wasn't some worthless shack. This was a masterpiece of hidden construction. The loose floorboard he'd discovered sat in the far corner, slightly raised as if something beneath had pushed it up over time. Jake knelt and worked his fingers around the edges. The board came up easily, revealing a cavity that had been carefully carved into the foundation stones. Inside was a metal box, green with age but intact. Jake lifted it out, surprised by its weight. The lid opened with a soft click, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. Stacks of old bills filled one side of the box, bound with rubber bands that crumbled at his touch. But it was the other contents that made his hands shake. Photographs showed men in expensive suits shaking hands with rough mountain folk. A leather journal contained names, dates, and dollar amounts that made Jake's head spin. And at the bottom, a map of the mountain region marked with X's and notations in different handwriting. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents, Whitmore. Jake's blood went cold. The same family name as the fraternity boy who'd sold him the cabin. As he flipped through the journal, a pattern emerged. The Whitmores hadn't just owned coal mines. They'd been partners with the mountain families in something much more lucrative and dangerous. The dates went back decades, connecting respected businessmen with notorious moonshiners and worse. A photograph slipped from between the journal's pages. Jake recognized his grandfather's face immediately, much younger, but unmistakable. He stood beside a man in an expensive suit, both of them smiling beside what looked like a massive still operation. The man in the suit was labeled on the back, E. Whitmore, 1987. Jake's mind raced. Brad Whitmore's father. His grandfather had been in business with Brad's father, and clearly that business had been profitable enough to require this level of secrecy. But why hide everything here? And why had the Whitmores been so eager to get rid of the property? The answer came in the form of a final document at the bottom of the box. A contract, signed by both families, establishing this cabin as a neutral meeting ground and repository for their shared records. Insurance, his grandfather had called it in his distinctive handwriting. Protection for both sides. Now, Jake held that protection, and he was beginning to understand that the fraternity boy's cruel joke had just handed him the most dangerous inheritance in the mountains. The morning sun cast long shadows through the bare trees as Jake made his way up the winding dirt path to what was now, improbably, his property. The legal papers crinkled in his jacket pocket with each step, still smelling faintly of expensive cologne from when Madison had thrust them at him with that cruel smile. Even now, 12 hours later, he could hardly believe it had really happened. The cabin sat in a small clearing, looking even more decrepit in daylight than it had in the fading evening light when he'd first laid eyes on it. The roof sagged in the middle like a swayback horse, and several windows were boarded up with weather-beaten plywood. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips that reminded Jake of his grandmother's old wallpaper. Weeds had grown up around the foundation so thick they nearly reached the windows, but it was his. For better or worse, it belonged to him now. Jake pulled out his phone and called his sister Emma back home. She answered on the second ring, her voice already tinged with worry. "Jake, you said you'd call last night. I was starting to think—" "I'm fine, Em. Something happened, though. Something big." He told her everything, from the party invitation to the mocking laughter to the legal documents now burning a hole in his pocket. Emma listened in silence until he finished. "They what?" Her voice rose an octave. "Jake, please tell me you didn't actually give them money." $1. And before you say anything, I know how it sounds, but the paperwork is legitimate. I had it checked by Professor Morrison this morning before I came up here." Emma sighed. "Even if it's real, honey, what are you going to do with a falling-down cabin in the middle of nowhere? You can barely afford textbooks as it is." Jake looked up at the sagging structure before him. She had a point. Even if he could somehow fix the place up, what then? He couldn't live here. It was too far from campus, and he certainly couldn't afford to maintain 2 residences. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'm here now, so I might as well take a look inside." The front door hung crooked on its hinges. The wood around the lock splintered, as if someone had forced their way in years ago. Jake pushed it open, wincing at the prolonged squeal of rusted hinges. The smell hit him immediately. Musty air, rotting wood, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, streaming through gaps in the boarded windows. The main room was larger than he'd expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a narrow staircase leading to what must be a loft. Someone had left furniture behind, a moth-eaten couch, a wooden table with one leg shorter than the others, and several chairs in various states of decay. "Hello!" Jake called out, feeling foolish but wanting to make sure he wasn't disturbing any squatters. His voice echoed back to him, hollow and strange. He made his way carefully across the uneven floorboards, testing each step before putting his full weight down. Some of the boards sagged alarmingly, and he made mental notes of the worst spots. The kitchen was barely worthy of the name. Just a few cabinets, a rusty sink, and space where appliances had once stood. A back door led to what had probably been a small porch, though now only rotting support posts remained. The staircase creaked ominously as he climbed to the loft. Up here, the roof damage was more obvious. Water stains spread across the ceiling like abstract art, and in one corner he could see daylight through a hole in the shingles. But the space was surprisingly large, running almost the full length of the cabin. Jake was about to head back downstairs when something caught his eye. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a fallen beam, was what looked like a metal box. He picked his way carefully across the damaged floor, testing each board before stepping. The box was old but solid, made of heavy steel and about the size of a briefcase. It had no visible lock, just a simple latch that had been painted over so many times the mechanism was barely recognizable. Jake tried to open it, but years of paint and rust had sealed it shut. He carried it downstairs and outside, where the light was better. Using his pocket knife, he scraped away paint and rust from around the latch. After several minutes of careful work, he heard a small click. The latch gave way. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and time, was a leather journal bound with a cracked rubber band. Beneath it lay what appeared to be official documents, yellowed with age but still legible, and at the bottom of the box, Jake's breath caught in his throat. Maps. Hand-drawn maps showing the mountain area around the cabin, with careful notations in faded ink, and scattered across several of them, marked with small X's and detailed notes, were locations that made Jake's pulse quicken. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Be careful up there. Call when you're heading back." Jake stared at the maps, his mind racing. Maybe Madison and her friends hadn't played the joke they thought they had. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of the old cabin as Jake stood in what might generously be called the main room. The floorboards creaked ominously under his weight, and he could see daylight through gaps in the wall chinking. A family of mice had clearly made themselves at home in one corner, their droppings scattered like dark confetti across the warped planks. He'd spent the night in his truck, parked outside what was now officially his property. The deed, crumpled but legal, sat folded in his back pocket like a talisman. Every few minutes, he found himself touching it through the denim, still unable to believe what had happened. The rich kid's laughter echoed in his memory. Madison's perfectly manicured fingers had barely touched the pen as she signed the deed transfer, her nose wrinkled in disgust at the very thought of owning something so beneath her station. "God, I can't wait to tell everyone about this," she'd said, pulling out her phone to document their hilarious prank. Jake pushed the memory aside and focused on his surroundings. The cabin was roughly 20 by 30 feet, with a stone fireplace that looked sturdy despite its age. A narrow ladder led to what appeared to be a sleeping loft, though he wasn't sure the rotted rungs would support his weight. The whole structure leaned slightly to the left, as if tired from decades of mountain weather, but it was his. He walked to the fireplace and ran his hand along the rough stone mantel. His grandfather had taught him about construction during those precious summer visits before the old man died. These stones were fitted with care, each one selected and placed by someone who knew their craft. The mortar between them had held for what looked like 50 years or more. Something caught his eye. One of the stones in the hearth sat slightly proud of the others, its edges worn smooth as if from frequent handling. Jake knelt and pressed against it experimentally. It shifted under pressure. His pulse quickened. He pulled out his truck keys and used the metal edge to work around the stone's perimeter. After several minutes of careful prying, it came free in his hands, revealing a dark cavity behind it. Jake's breath caught. His fingers found the edge of something wrapped in oiled cloth, wedged deep into the hidden space. He worked it free carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he unwrapped what felt like a bundle of papers. The first document made his knees go weak. It was a survey map, hand-drawn but precise, showing the boundaries of his property. But the boundaries extended far beyond what he'd assumed. The cabin sat on nearly 40 acres of mountainside, including a significant portion of the ridge that overlooked the valley below. The second document was even more stunning. A geological survey from the 1970s, marked confidential in red ink across the top. Someone had made handwritten notes in the margins, circling sections and adding annotations in faded blue ink. Words jumped out at him: significant mineral deposits, preliminary core samples positive, and recommend immediate further exploration. But it was the third document that made Jake sit down hard on the dusty floor. A letter dated just 5 years ago, written on the letterhead of Morrison Development Corporation, the same company whose logo he'd seen on billboards announcing the new luxury resort being built in the valley. The letter was addressed to property owner and offered to purchase mineral and development rights for any land holdings above the 1,000-foot elevation mark. The offered price made Jake's vision blur: $500,000 for mineral rights alone. His mind raced. Madison's father worked in development. He'd heard her mention it during her cruel performance yesterday. Did the family know about this survey? Was that why they'd been so eager to humiliate him publicly, to make the sale seem like a joke rather than a legitimate transaction? Jake read the geological survey more carefully. The handwritten notes referenced copper deposits and possible silver veins, but also mentioned something called rare earth elements, with a notation that these were increasingly valuable for technology applications. He thought about his phone, his truck's GPS system, the laptop computers he'd seen the college kids carrying. All of them probably contained materials that might be buried right beneath his feet. A sound outside made him freeze. A car engine, growing closer. Jake quickly rewrapped the documents and shoved them back into their hiding place, replacing the stone with practiced movements. By the time Madison's silver BMW pulled up outside, he was standing casually by the window, hands in his pockets. She climbed out wearing designer hiking boots that had clearly never seen actual dirt, her expression a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Well, well," she called out as she approached the cabin. "I just had to see how our little charity case was settling into his new mansion." Jake stepped outside to meet her, keeping his expression neutral despite the fire burning in his chest. "Mighty kind of you to check on me." "Oh, I'm not here to check on you," Madison said, her smile sharp as broken glass. "I'm here to make you an offer." The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of what was now Ezra's cabin, casting long shadows across the dusty floorboards. He'd spent the night curled up in his sleeping bag, listening to the old structure settle and creak around him. Every sound had been a symphony of possibility. This was his place, his refuge, bought and paid for with honest money. Ezra pulled on his worn boots and stepped outside to survey his domain in daylight. The cabin sat on maybe 2 acres of overgrown land, pine trees pressing close on 3 sides. A rusted mailbox leaned drunkenly at the end of a dirt path that connected to the main road. Behind the structure, he could make out the remnants of what might have been a garden, now choked with weeds and brambles. The exterior looked even worse in full sunlight. Shingles hung loose or missing entirely, and the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated debris. But Ezra saw potential where others saw decay. He'd grown up fixing things with his grandfather, learning to make do with whatever materials they could scrounge. This was just another project, albeit the biggest one he'd ever tackled alone. He spent the morning clearing the porch, hauling away rotted boards and accumulated trash. The physical work felt good after months of sitting in lecture halls, pretending to belong among students who spent more on textbooks than his family made in a month. Here, his calloused hands and strong back were assets, not embarrassments. Around noon, Ezra decided to explore the interior more thoroughly. The main room held little of interest. A few pieces of furniture, too damaged to be worth anything, some old magazines dating back to the 1980s, and layers of dust thick enough to write his name in. The kitchen was a disaster of rust-stained fixtures and cabinets that had warped beyond repair. But it was the bedroom that drew his attention. Something about the proportions felt off. He paced the length of the room, then stepped outside to measure the exterior wall. Unless he was miscalculating, there should be another 3 feet of space somewhere. Back inside, he examined the walls more carefully. The back wall was covered in cheap paneling that didn't match the rest of the room. When he knocked on it, the sound was hollow in places, solid in others. His pulse quickened as he searched for an edge, a seam, anything that might indicate the paneling could be removed. He found it near the corner, a section where the wood grain didn't quite align. Ezra worked his fingers behind the panel and pulled. It came away with a screech of old nails, revealing a narrow door set into the original wall behind it. The door was locked, but the wood around the latch was soft with age. One good shove with his shoulder, and it sprang open with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire cabin. Cool air rushed out, carrying scents of cedar and something else, something metallic. Ezra fumbled for his phone's flashlight and stepped into the hidden room. It was small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with no windows. The walls were lined with rough-hewn shelves, and on those shelves sat dozens of mason jars. But these weren't filled with preserves or pickled vegetables. Each jar contained what looked like small rocks, crystals, and metallic chunks that glinted in his phone's light. Ezra lifted one jar and held it close to the light. The contents were definitely minerals of some kind, but he couldn't identify them. Some pieces had the dull gleam of tarnished silver. Others showed streaks of green and blue that might be copper ore. A few jars held what appeared to be chunks of quartz shot through with gold veins. At the back of the room sat a wooden crate filled with old cloth bags, each tied with string and labeled in faded ink. Ezra couldn't make out all the writing, but he caught words like Copper Creek and North Ridge, locations maybe, claims. His hands shook as he explored further. This wasn't just a collection of pretty rocks. Someone had been mining, seriously mining, and storing their finds here. The question was whether any of it was actually valuable, or just the wishful thinking of an amateur prospector. On the bottom shelf, wrapped in oiled cloth, he found a leather journal. The pages were yellow with age, but the writing was still legible. It appeared to be records of mining activities, with dates going back 15 years. Names, locations, quantities, even crude maps showing where specific minerals had been found. Ezra sank to the floor, journal in his lap, surrounded by jars of mysterious stones. The college kids who'd sold him this place for $1 had mocked him, called him a fool. But sitting in this hidden room, surrounded by what might be a fortune in precious metals and minerals, Ezra began to think the joke might be on them. He needed answers, needed to know what he was really looking at. Tomorrow, he'd take some samples to someone who could identify them properly. Tonight, he'd guard his secret and plan his next move carefully. The silence that followed Ezra's departure felt heavier than the mountain air itself. Marcus stared at the crumpled dollar bill in his palm, the weight of what had just transpired settling like stones in his stomach. Around him, his friends erupted in nervous laughter and high fives, but their celebration felt hollow, echoing off the cabin's weathered walls with an almost mocking resonance. "Did you see his face?" Tyler wheezed, doubling over with laughter. "He actually thought he was getting some kind of deal." Jessica giggled, but there was something strained about it now. The poor thing probably thinks he can flip it for a profit or something. Marcus folded the dollar bills slowly, methodically, his eyes never leaving the spot where Ezra had disappeared into the tree line. Something about the mountain boy's calm acceptance bothered him more than he cared to admit. There had been no gratitude in those steady grey eyes, no excitement, no indication that he'd been fooled. If anything, Ezra had looked almost knowing. "We should probably head back," Sarah said, wrapping her designer jacket tighter around herself. The temperature was dropping as afternoon shadows lengthened across the clearing. "This place gives me the creeps." But Marcus found himself drawn toward the cabin despite his unease. The structure looked even more decrepit up close. with loose boards hanging like broken teeth and windows so grimy they were nearly opaque. Paint peeled in long, curling strips, and the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated debris. "What are you doing?" Jessica called, as Marcus approached the front door. "Just looking around," he replied, testing the first porch step. It held his weight, though it groaned ominously. "I mean, we technically own this place now, right?" The front door was secured with a heavy padlock that looked surprisingly new compared to the rest of the cabin's hardware. Marcus rattled it experimentally, noting how solid and well-maintained it felt in his hands. Strange choice for securing what was essentially a pile of rotting lumber. "Dude, leave it alone," Connor said, but there was curiosity in his voice too. "We're not actually keeping this dump." "Then why did we buy it?" The question came from Tyler, who had stopped laughing and was now studying the cabin with newfound interest. "I mean, seriously, why go through all that paperwork for a joke?" Marcus didn't have a good answer. The whole thing had started as an impulse, a cruel bit of entertainment at the mountain boy's expense. But now, standing here in the gathering dusk, he wondered if there was something more to it. The cabin sat on what had to be valuable land, remote but accessible, with stunning views of the valley below. Even in its current state, the property had to be worth more than $1. "Maybe we should come back tomorrow," Sarah suggested, "with bolt cutters or something, just to see what's inside." The idea sent an unexpected thrill through Marcus. There was something almost archaeological about the prospect of opening up this sealed time capsule. Who knew what they might find inside? Old furniture, maybe some antiques worth selling. Hell, even the land itself might have development potential. As they walked back toward their cars, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several times he glanced over his shoulder, scanning the darkening forest for any sign of movement. The mountain held its secrets close, and somewhere in those shadows, Ezra Blackwood was probably having the last laugh. "I still can't believe he actually signed the papers," Jessica said as they reached the vehicles. "I mean, who buys property without even looking at it first?" "Someone who knows something we don't," Marcus muttered, then caught himself. The others looked at him strangely. "What's that supposed to mean?" Connor asked. Marcus shrugged, not wanting to voice his growing suspicions. But the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that they'd been played. Ezra's reaction had been too controlled, too measured. No one was that calm about losing their family's legacy unless they knew something their tormentors didn't. The drive back to campus was subdued, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Marcus found himself replaying every moment of their encounter with Ezra, searching for clues he might have missed. The way the mountain boy had studied the contract so carefully, the questions he'd asked about mineral rights and easements, the almost imperceptible smile that had flickered across his face when he'd signed his name. By the time they reached the university, Marcus had made a decision. Tomorrow he would return to the cabin alone. Something was hidden in that ramshackle structure, something valuable enough that Ezra Blackwood was willing to let them think they'd gotten the better of him. Whatever secret the cabin held, Marcus intended to find it first. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of the cabin as Jake carefully photographed every angle of the gold nuggets. His hands trembled slightly as he held his phone, the weight of his discovery still sinking in. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the glittering pile, afraid it might vanish like some cruel dream. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch. Jake reluctantly closed the strongbox, though leaving the gold felt like abandoning a newborn child. He needed supplies, and more importantly, he needed answers. The drive down the mountain felt different now. Every pothole and curve seemed to mock the luxury cars that had struggled up this same path just days ago. Jake found himself gripping the steering wheel of his battered pickup truck with newfound purpose. Those rich kids had no idea what they'd done. At Millfield Hardware, Old Pete Morrison looked up from his newspaper with surprise. "Jake, what brings you down from the mountains so early?" "Need some supplies for the cabin," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Security stuff. Maybe some better locks." Pete raised an eyebrow. "Finally fixing up the old Hartwell place? That's been empty for near 20 years. Your grandfather used to come in here regular, you know." "Good man, Samuel Hartwell." Jake's blood froze. "Samuel Hartwell? Course. Didn't you know? That cabin belonged to Sam Hartwell before he passed. Strange fellow toward the end, always talking about protecting his legacy. His family sold it off after he died, but nobody wanted to live way up there." Pete scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Come to think of it, wasn't your mama's maiden name Hartwell?" The pieces clicked together in Jake's mind like a puzzle he'd been trying to solve his entire life. His mother had rarely spoken about her family, only mentioning that her father had been a prospector who died when she was young. She'd taken her husband's name when she married, and Jake had never thought to dig deeper into his maternal lineage. "Pete," Jake said carefully, "what else do you remember about Samuel Hartwell?" "Oh, Sam was legendary around these parts. Spent 40 years working these mountains, found more gold than anybody else in the county. But he was secretive about it, never trusted banks much. Always said the government would just take what belonged to him." Pete leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Folks used to say he hid his fortune somewhere, but after he died nobody ever found nothing. Family figured it was just old man talk." Jake's heart pounded as he gathered the supplies he needed, his mind racing. The college kids hadn't just sold him any random cabin, they'd unknowingly sold him his own inheritance. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Back at the cabin, Jake examined the property with fresh eyes. If Samuel Hartwell was his grandfather, then everything made sense. The hidden compartment, the gold, even the cabin's isolated location, it had all been designed to protect a legacy meant for family. He spent the afternoon installing new locks and exploring every inch of the property. Behind the cabin, partially hidden by overgrown brush, he discovered what looked like the entrance to an old mine shaft. The opening was sealed with newer boards, but Jake could see where someone had recently disturbed the area. As evening approached, Jake sat on the cabin's front porch, staring out at the valley below. Somewhere down there, Braden, Chase, and Madison were probably laughing about their clever prank, completely unaware that they'd just made the biggest mistake of their privileged lives. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "How's the job search going, honey? Don't forget you have bills due next week." Jake stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Things are looking up, Mom. Better than I ever imagined." He didn't mention the cabin or the gold. Not yet. First, he needed to understand exactly what he'd inherited and figure out how to handle it properly. The last thing he wanted was to make a mistake that would cost him everything. As darkness fell, Jake locked the cabin securely and made the drive back to his apartment in town. But his mind remained on the mountain, planning his next moves. Tomorrow, he would return with proper mining equipment and explore that sealed shaft. Something told him the nuggets in the strongbox were just the beginning. The rich kids had thought they were so clever, turning his desperation into their entertainment. They'd probably already forgotten about him, moved on to their next victim. But Jake wouldn't forget. He had patience, the kind that came from years of struggle, and now he had something else. He had power. And soon, very soon, Braden Matthews and his friends would learn what it felt like to be on the wrong side of fortune's wheel. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cabin's windows as Jake spread the geological survey maps across the old wooden table. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the property lines with his finger, cross-referencing them with the mineral rights documents he discovered in the metal box. The implications were staggering. According to the surveys, his $1 cabin sat directly atop what geologists had identified as a significant mineral deposit. The reports, dating back 15 years, detailed extensive copper, silver, and rare earth element reserves extending deep beneath the property. More intriguingly, a handwritten note clipped to one survey mentioned anomalous readings suggesting potential precious metal concentrations. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from his geology professor, Dr. Martinez. Sample analysis complete. Can you come in today? Results are interesting. 20 minutes later, Jake was hiking down the mountain trail, the small rock samples secured in his backpack. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was walking away from potentially millions of dollars to attend classes he could barely afford. But he needed confirmation before making any moves, especially with the Ashford family's influence looming over everything. At the university, Dr. Martinez's expression was unreadable as she led Jake into her lab. "Where exactly did you find these samples?" she asked, pulling up detailed analysis results on her computer screen. "From some property I recently acquired," Jake replied carefully. "Well, whoever owned this land before you either didn't know what they had, or they kept it very quiet." She pointed to the chemical breakdown displayed on screen. "These samples show significant copper content, trace amounts of silver, and something else entirely. See these readings here?" Jake leaned forward, studying the data he couldn't fully interpret. "Gold," Dr. Martinez continued. "Not just traces, but concentrations that would make any mining company very interested. And this," she highlighted another section, "rare earth elements, the kind used in electronics, renewable energy technology. Very valuable, very much in demand." Jake's mouth went dry. "How valuable are we talking?" "That depends on the extent of the deposit. But if these samples are representative of a larger area," she paused, studying his face. "Jake, you need to be very careful about who you share this information with, and you need legal counsel immediately." The weight of her words settled over him as he walked across campus. Lost in thought, he almost didn't notice the black sedan parked outside the geology building until he was climbing into his truck. Through his rearview mirror, he watched a man in an expensive suit emerge from the passenger seat and enter the building he'd just left. His phone rang as he started the engine. "Unknown number. Jake Brennan?" The voice was smooth, professional. "Yeah? My name is Richard Ashford. I believe you know my son, Trevor. I think it's time we had a conversation." Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "About what?" "About a certain property transaction that may have been premature. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous sum to reverse the sale. $10,000 cash today. The cabin's not for sale." A pause. "Mr. Brennan, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. My family has significant interests in that area. It would be unfortunate if zoning issues or environmental concerns were to complicate your ownership." The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Ashford? I'm offering you a way out before things become complicated. 20,000. Final offer." Jake thought about the geological reports, the mineral surveys, Dr. Martinez's analysis. No deal. The line went quiet for several seconds. "I see. Well, Mr. Brennan, I hope you have a good lawyer. You're going to need one." The call ended, leaving Jake staring at his phone. $20,000, more money than his family had ever seen at one time. But it was nothing compared to what lay beneath his property, and Richard Ashford's desperation to buy it back confirmed everything. He drove home with one eye on his mirrors, noting the same black sedan maintaining distance behind him. At the general store where his mother worked, he pulled over and went inside. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important." Sarah Brennan looked up from inventory sheets, concern creasing her weathered face. "What's wrong? Remember that cabin I bought? I think I'm going to need help. Legal help." She set down her clipboard. "Jake, we can't afford—" "We can't afford not to," he interrupted. "Mom, what if I told you that cabin might be worth more than we ever imagined? What if I told you it might change everything for our family?" His mother studied his face, seeing something there she hadn't seen before. Not just hope, but conviction. I'd say you better be very sure about what you're getting us into." Outside, the black sedan waited, its occupants making no effort to hide their surveillance. Jake realized the game had changed. The Ashfords weren't just embarrassed rich kids anymore. They were adversaries with resources, connections, and apparently knowledge about his property they'd never revealed. The real battle was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's interior as Jake carefully examined every inch of the walls, floors, and ceiling. His fingers traced along the wooden planks, searching for any hidden compartments or loose boards that might conceal more secrets. The discovery of the deed had opened his eyes to possibilities he'd never imagined, but something told him there was more to uncover. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with questions about old Ezra Blackwood and why the man had chosen to hide such valuable documents in this remote cabin. The property deed alone was worth a fortune, but Jake's instinct suggested it was just the beginning. Working methodically, he started in the main room where he'd found the first cache. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he examined each one, looking for signs of disturbance or concealment. Near the stone fireplace, he noticed a subtle difference in the wood grain of one particular board. Unlike the others, this plank showed less wear, as if it had been removed and replaced multiple times over the years. Jake retrieved his knife and carefully pried at the edges. The board lifted easily, revealing another hidden space beneath. His heart hammered as he reached inside and felt the familiar texture of oiled cloth. This bundle was larger than the first, heavier in his hands. Unwrapping it with trembling fingers, Jake gasped at what lay within. Maps. Dozens of hand-drawn maps showing mining claims, underground tunnel systems, and geological surveys of the entire mountain region. But these weren't ordinary maps. They were marked with symbols and notations that clearly indicated active mining operations, ore deposits, and extraction routes. One map in particular caught his attention. It showed a detailed layout of underground passages that seemed to run directly beneath the cabin itself. According to the markings, these tunnels connected to a vast network of mining shafts that extended for miles through the mountain. At several key points, someone had drawn symbols that looked like they marked significant ore deposits. Jake spread the maps across the cabin floor, trying to piece together their meaning. The dates, penciled in various corners, spanned nearly 30 years, suggesting that Ezra Blackwood had been documenting mining activity in this region for decades. Some of the newer maps showed areas that Jake recognized, places where modern mining companies had only recently begun operations. A chill ran down his spine as he realized what he was looking at. These weren't just historical documents. They were intelligence reports. Ezra Blackwood had been systematically mapping and documenting every mining operation in the region, tracking the movement of companies, the discovery of new deposits, and the expansion of existing claims. But why? And more importantly, how had an old mountain hermit gained access to such detailed information about corporate mining operations? Jake turned his attention to a leather journal buried beneath the maps. The pages were filled with Ezra's careful handwriting, documenting meetings, conversations, and observations. As Jake read, a picture began to emerge of a man who was far more connected and informed than anyone had realized. The entries revealed that Ezra had worked for decades as a geological consultant, hired by various mining companies to survey and assess potential sites. His expertise had taken him throughout the region, giving him unprecedented access to confidential information about ore deposits, company plans, and future development projects. But somewhere along the way, Ezra had begun playing a different game. Instead of simply providing services to the mining companies, he'd started acquiring strategic properties of his own. The journal detailed his careful purchases of seemingly worthless land that he knew would become valuable once the mining companies discovered what lay beneath. Jake's hands shook as he read entry after entry, describing Ezra's methodical accumulation of property rights, mineral claims, and water rights throughout the mountain region. The old man had spent 30 years positioning himself to control access to some of the richest mineral deposits in the state. The final entries in the journal were the most revealing. Ezra wrote about his failing health and his concern about what would happen to his accumulated wealth after his death. He'd had no family, no heirs, and no one he'd trusted with the knowledge of what he'd built, so he'd made a decision that was both brilliant and desperate. He would hide everything and wait for the right person to find it. According to the journal, Ezra had deliberately let the cabin appear abandoned and worthless, knowing that eventually someone would discover it. He'd gambled that whoever found his hiding places would be someone like himself, someone overlooked and underestimated by the wealthy and powerful. Jake sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd inherited. The property deed he'd found yesterday wasn't just for the cabin and its immediate surroundings. According to these maps and documents, he now owned mineral rights and access points that could control the entire mountain's mining future. The rich college kids who'd sold him the cabin for $1 hadn't just made a mistake. They'd handed him the keys to an empire that their own family's companies would need to negotiate with if they wanted to continue their operations in the region. The silence in Marcus's dorm room was deafening after Jake stormed out, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and wounded pride. Marcus stared at the closed door, his hands still trembling slightly from the confrontation. He'd never stood up to someone like Jake before, never felt the intoxicating rush of turning the tables on those who'd tormented him. But triumph quickly gave way to unease. Jake's parting words echoed in his mind. This isn't over. Marcus knew enough about the Harrington family's influence to understand that wasn't an empty threat. Old money didn't just buy things. It bought people, favors, and ways to make problems disappear. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Coffee? Need to talk." They met at the small cafe off campus, where they'd had their first real conversation. Elena looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she'd slept as poorly as he had. She clutched her coffee cup like a lifeline, steam rising between them in the cool morning air. "My father knows," she said without preamble. "About us meeting, about you having the cabin, everything." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "How?" "Jake called him last night, told him some version of what happened, probably made you sound like you were threatening him." Elena's laugh was bitter. "Dad's flying in tomorrow. He wants to meet you." "That doesn't sound like a social visit." "It's not." Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Marcus, there's something I haven't told you, about why that cabin was really put up for sale." The way she said it made his blood run cold. "What do you mean?" Elena glanced around nervously before continuing. 3 years ago, my family was involved in a development project up in those mountains. They wanted to build a luxury resort, but there were complications. Environmental concerns, some local opposition, and then there was an accident. "What kind of accident?" "A landslide during construction. 2 workers died." Her hands shook as she lifted her coffee cup. The investigation concluded it was just unstable soil, but there were rumors. People said corners were cut, safety protocols ignored to save money and time. Marcus stared at her, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in his mind. "And the cabin?" "It belonged to one of the workers who died, Thomas Brennan. When his family couldn't afford the property taxes and legal fees from fighting the development, they had to sell. That's how it ended up in our portfolio of assets." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Thomas Brennan. He remembered seeing that name carved into one of the support beams in the cabin's basement, along with others. Workers' signatures, he'd assumed, but now he wondered if they meant something more. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Marcus leaned across the table. Was that sale really just Jake's idea of a joke? Her silence stretched too long, and when she finally met his eyes, he saw the answer before she spoke. My father has been trying to buy back properties in that area quietly. The resort project isn't dead, it's just been postponed. When Jake told him what they'd done, selling you the cabin for $1, she trailed off. He saw an opportunity, Marcus finished. Let some poor kid think he got lucky, then find a way to take it back, probably for a lot less than market value. Elena nodded miserably. I think they're planning to claim the sale was fraudulent somehow, that you coerced Jake or that he wasn't authorized to make the transaction. With enough lawyers and the right pressure. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete. I have to go. Marcus, wait. But he was already walking away, his mind racing. Everything made sense now. The survey equipment he'd seen in the woods, the way Jake's friends had been so eager to film the joke, even Jake's genuine surprise when Marcus had fought back. They'd expected him to be grateful for their scraps, compliant when they came to take it all back. He drove to the cabin faster than was safe on the winding mountain roads, his truck's engine straining against the steep grades. The building looked different now, knowing what he knew. Not just a refuge or even a gold mine, but a monument to someone's death, a piece of a larger conspiracy that stretched back years. In the basement, he found the beam again. T. Brennan, 1987 to 2019. Below it, in smaller letters that he'd missed before, they knew. Marcus pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the signature, of the hidden room, of every piece of evidence he'd found. If the Harrington family wanted a fight, he'd give them one. But this time, he wouldn't be the naive mountain boy they expected. This time, he'd be ready. The silence in Marcus's dorm room felt suffocating as he stared at the legal documents spread across his desk. 3 days had passed since the town meeting, and the weight of his decision pressed down on him like the mountain fog that used to roll through his grandmother's holler. Outside his window, the manicured campus lawn stretched endlessly, a stark reminder of the world he'd tried so hard to join. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Before he could respond, the door swung open and Ethan strode in, his usual confident smirk replaced by something harder, more desperate. Behind him lurked Cameron and Tyler, their faces pale and drawn. We need to talk, Ethan said, closing the door with deliberate force. Marcus slowly gathered the papers, his movements careful and measured. I figured you'd show up eventually. You're making a mistake, Ethan continued, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. This whole savior complex you've got going on, it's going to ruin you. Is that a threat? Marcus asked quietly, not looking up from the documents. Cameron stepped forward, his nervous energy filling the small space. Look, Marcus, we can work something out. The development deal, there's enough money there for everyone. You don't have to play the hero. Marcus finally raised his eyes, studying the 3 young men who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable. Now they looked like what they truly were. Scared kids who'd bitten off more than they could chew. Funny thing about heroes, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. They usually don't set out to be one. They just do what's right when the moment comes. Tyler, who had been silent until now, suddenly exploded. Right? You think destroying our futures is right? Do you have any idea what's at stake here? Your futures. Marcus stood slowly, his full height imposing in the cramped dorm room. What about the futures of the families you're trying to displace? What about the history you want to bulldoze for profit? Ethan's composure cracked completely. You hypocrite! You could have stayed in your little mountain paradise, but you came here just like us. You wanted what we have. You're right, Marcus admitted, his honesty catching them off guard. I did want what you have. I thought education, success, fitting in. I thought that would make me better somehow, make me worthy. He moved to the window, gazing out at the campus that had once intimidated him. But you know what I learned? Worth isn't something you can buy or fake or inherit. It comes from standing up when it matters, even when it costs you everything. This is insane, Cameron muttered, running his hands through his hair. Our families are going to kill us. The investors are already asking questions. Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to play games with people's lives, Marcus replied. Ethan's face flushed red. Games? You think this is a game? We offered you a partnership, a real chance to be part of something big, but you're too proud, too stubborn to see it. I see it clearly, Marcus said, turning back to face them. I see 3 privileged kids who thought they could manipulate a poor mountain boy for their own gain. The only thing you didn't count on was that maybe, just maybe, I'd fight back. The room fell silent except for the sound of Tyler's labored breathing. The weight of their miscalculation hung heavy in the air. There's still time, Ethan said finally, his voice taking on a pleading quality that Marcus had never heard before. The town meeting was just talk. Nothing's been filed yet. We can still make this work for everyone. Marcus walked to his desk and picked up a thick manila envelope. Actually, something has been filed. He held up the documents. I've established a conservation trust. The cabin and the surrounding land, all of it, is now protected in perpetuity. The color drained from Ethan's face. You can't do that. Already done. My grandmother always said the mountains don't belong to us, we belong to them. I'm just making sure future generations understand that. Cameron sank into Marcus's desk chair, his head in his hands. We're ruined. No, Marcus said, his voice surprisingly gentle. You're just learning what the rest of us figured out a long time ago, that actions have consequences, that other people matter, that some things are more important than money. Tyler stepped toward the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Come on, guys. There's nothing more to say here. As they filed out, Ethan paused in the doorway. This isn't over, Marcus. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started. Marcus met his gaze steadily. Maybe not, but I know what I've finished. Your plan to destroy my home. And that's enough for now. The door slammed shut, leaving Marcus alone with his decision and the certain knowledge that the real battle was just beginning. The sound of approaching engines cut through the morning mist like a warning bell. Jake dropped the ledger he'd been studying and moved to the cabin window, his stomach knotting as he counted the vehicles winding up the mountain road. 3 black SUVs, moving with the kind of purposeful determination that spelled trouble. He grabbed his backpack, already packed with the most critical documents, and slipped out the back door. The hiding spot he'd prepared in the rocks above the cabin would give him a clear view while keeping him invisible. As he settled into position, the first SUV pulled into the clearing. Marcus stepped out, but he wasn't the same arrogant college boy who'd sold the cabin for $1. His movements were sharp, controlled, and he wore an expensive suit that screamed corporate power. Behind him emerged 2 men in identical dark clothing, their eyes constantly scanning the perimeter with military precision. Spread out, Marcus commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made Jake's blood run cold. Check every inch. I want to know what he found. The second SUV disgorged more security personnel, while the third revealed Cynthia and Bradley, both looking nervous, but trying to mask it with their usual entitled swagger. Cynthia had traded her designer campus wear for what she probably thought was appropriate mountain attire, clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salary. This is insane, Marcus, Bradley muttered, glancing around the wilderness like it might bite him. We should have just offered him money to keep quiet. Marcus turned on him with a look that could have frozen fire. Money? You think this is about money anymore? He knows about the trust, about the mining rights, about everything. If word gets out about what we did, what we've been covering up, it won't matter how much money we have. Jake felt puzzle pieces clicking into place in his mind. The trust. That explained the complex web of shell companies and transfers he'd been tracing. The Pemberton family hadn't just stolen his great-grandfather's land. They'd been systematically looting a trust fund that should have been protecting it. "Sir?" one of the security men called from the cabin door. "The lock's been changed, but it's a standard deadbolt. Want me to—" "Do it," Marcus snapped. The man produced a small device that made quick work of the lock. Within minutes, they were swarming through Jake's cabin like locusts, rifling through every drawer, every hiding place, every carefully organized stack of documents he'd left behind as decoys. "It's not here," Cynthia said, emerging from the bedroom with cobwebs in her perfectly styled hair. "None of the real documents are here. Just copies of things we already know about." Marcus's face darkened. "Then he's smarter than we gave him credit for." He pulled out his phone and barked orders to someone on the other end. "I want a trace on Jake Morrison, bank accounts, credit cards, any movement at all. And I want it now." From his rocky perch, Jake photographed everything with his phone. The license plates, the faces, the clear evidence of breaking and entering. But more importantly, he was recording their conversation, and what he heard next made his blood boil. "The old man made this mess," Marcus continued, pacing like a caged predator. "If my grandfather hadn't been so sloppy with the paperwork back in the 50s, we wouldn't be dealing with this now. But he's dead, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let some mountain trash destroy 4 generations of Pemberton wealth." "What if we can't find him?" Bradley asked, his voice cracking slightly. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only cold calculation. "Oh, we'll find him. Men like Jake Morrison always have pressure points. Family, friends, people they care about. Nobody lives completely alone." The threat was clear, and Jake felt his protective instincts surge. These people wouldn't hesitate to hurt innocent people to get what they wanted. He thought of Sarah, of the elderly couple who ran the diner in town, of all the people who'd shown him kindness. How many of them were now in danger because he'd discovered the truth? "Sir, you need to see this," one of the security men called from near the woodpile. He held up fragments of a manila envelope, partially burned. "Looks like he tried to destroy something but didn't finish the job." Marcus examined the fragments, his expression growing darker. "Banking records. He knows about the offshore accounts." He turned to his team with renewed urgency. "We're not just looking for documents anymore. We're looking for Jake Morrison himself. And when we find him, we're going to have a very serious conversation about keeping family secrets." As the search continued below, Jake carefully backed away from his hiding spot. He'd learned everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about money or land anymore. It was about a family willing to do anything to protect their stolen empire. The joke was definitely over, but the real game was just beginning. The photograph trembled in Jake's weathered hands as he stared at the face that had haunted his family for 3 generations. Marcus Whitmore smiled back from the faded image, his arm draped casually around a woman Jake now knew was his great-grandmother, Sarah, the same woman whose diary had revealed the truth about the Whitmore fortune, a truth built on theft, murder, and lies. Thunder rolled across the mountain as Jake set the photograph down beside the other evidence he'd gathered. Legal documents proving Marcus had cheated Sarah out of her land claim. Bank records showing deposits that matched exactly the amount Sarah had written about in her final entries. And most damning of all, a confession letter Marcus had never intended to send, admitting to pushing Sarah's husband off the cliff when he'd gotten too close to discovering the truth. The storm outside seemed fitting. Jake had spent the last 2 days in the hidden room beneath the cabin, piecing together a puzzle that revealed how his family had been systematically destroyed by the Whitmores. But now he held the power to return the favor. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "The lawyer says everything looks legitimate. When do you want to file?" Jake's thumb hovered over the keyboard. Elena Vasquez had proven herself trustworthy even after learning about the evidence. She'd connected him with Marcus Chen, a lawyer who specialized in historical property disputes and had a reputation for taking on wealthy families. Chen had been fascinated by the case, especially the documentation proving the original mining claims had been fraudulently transferred. Before Jake could respond to Elena, another message appeared, this one from an unknown number. We know what you found. Name your price. The blood in Jake's veins turned to ice. He'd been careful, but apparently not careful enough. The Whitmores had always been connected, always watching. He thought about Professor Williams and felt a fresh wave of anger. They'd probably bought him off years ago, just in case someone like Jake ever came along. Another message, meet us at the old mining office. Come alone. 1 hour. Jake stared at the phone, his mind racing. The old mining office had been abandoned for decades, sitting halfway down the mountain on a road barely wide enough for one vehicle. It would be the perfect place for an ambush, but it would also be the perfect place to end this on his terms. He gathered the most important documents and photographs, sealing them in a waterproof bag. The originals went into a safety deposit box Elena had helped him secure in town, but he'd brought copies for this confrontation. Whatever the Whitmores were planning, they'd learned that Jake Morrison wasn't the same helpless mountain boy they thought they could intimidate. The rain had intensified by the time Jake reached the mining office, his truck's headlights cutting through sheets of water, cascading down the windshield. 2 vehicles were already there, a black SUV and a silver sedan that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Jake recognized the sedan as belonging to Victoria Whitmore, the family matriarch who rarely left her estate. He tucked his .38 revolver into his jacket pocket, a gift from his grandfather that he'd never thought he'd need in a situation like this. The mountain had taught him to be prepared for anything, and the Whitmores had already proven they were capable of violence when their interests were threatened. The mining office's door hung crooked on rusted hinges, creaking in the wind. Jake pushed it open and stepped inside, water dripping from his jacket onto the rotted floorboards. 3 figures waited in the dim light cast by their phone flashlights. Victoria Whitmore stood in the center, her silver hair perfect despite the storm, her expensive coat unmarked by the rain. To her left stood her grandson Bradley, the same arrogant expression on his face that Jake remembered from their transaction. But it was the third figure that made Jake's hand move instinctively toward his weapon. Marcus Chen, the lawyer Elena had trusted, smiled apologetically. I'm sorry, Jake, but the Whitmores have been my clients much longer than you have. You son of a bitch, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. Mr. Morrison, you've caused us considerable inconvenience. That cabin was supposed to be demolished years ago, but my grandson's little joke complicated things. We're prepared to offer you $10 million for the property and everything you found inside. Jake laughed, a sound devoid of humor. 10 million. Your family stole land worth 50 times that amount. And you killed my great-great-grandfather. Alleged crimes from a century ago, Victoria replied smoothly. Difficult to prove, and even more difficult to prosecute. Take the money, Mr. Morrison. It's more than your family has ever seen. The wind howled through the broken windows as Jake considered his response. They thought they held all the cards, but they didn't know about Elena or the safety deposit box. They didn't know he'd already sent copies to 3 different newspapers. I've got a counteroffer, Jake said. The morning mist clung to the mountains like a shroud as Jake made his way through the forest, the leather satchel containing the photographs pressed against his side. Every shadow seemed to hold potential danger, every snapping twig a possible threat. The meeting with Marcus Blackwood was set for noon at the old mining office in Copper Falls, a neutral location that Jake hoped would provide some measure of safety. Sarah walked beside him, her face pale but determined. They'd spent the previous night going through every possible scenario. every way this could go wrong. The photographs were their only leverage, but they both knew Blackwood was a man who'd killed to protect his secrets. Trading with him felt like making a deal with the devil himself. "You don't have to do this," Jake said for the 10th time since they'd left the cabin. "I can meet him alone." "We've been through this," Sarah replied, adjusting her backpack. "You need someone watching your back. Besides, I'm the one who helped you figure out what those photos meant. I'm seeing this through." They reached the outskirts of Copper Falls just as the church bells chimed 11:30. The old mining office sat at the edge of town, a weathered building that had been abandoned for decades. Its broken windows stared out like hollow eyes, and weeds grew through cracks in the foundation. Jake felt his stomach twist as they approached. A black sedan was already parked outside, its engine ticking as it cooled. Through the dusty windshield, Jake could see the silhouette of a driver waiting behind the wheel. This wasn't just a simple meeting. Blackwood had come prepared. "Stay close," Jake whispered as they climbed the rotting steps to the front door. The interior of the building was dim and musty, shafts of sunlight cutting through the gloom from the broken windows. Marcus Blackwood stood in the center of the main room, his silver hair gleaming despite the poor light. He wore an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place in the derelict surroundings. "Mr. Coleman," Blackwood said, his voice carrying an oddly cordial tone. "Thank you for coming. And Miss Chen, I presume? Your reputation precedes you." Sarah stiffened beside Jake. The fact that Blackwood knew her name sent a chill down both their spines. "You said you wanted to make a deal," Jake said, cutting straight to the point. His hand rested on the satchel's strap, ready to run if necessary. "Indeed I do." Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You possess something that belongs to me, or rather, something that could cause me considerable inconvenience if it were to fall into the wrong hands. I'm prepared to compensate you handsomely for its return." "Compensate?" Jake's voice hardened. "You mean pay me to keep quiet about the fact that you murdered Thomas Whitmore?" The smile never wavered on Blackwood's face. Such dramatic language. Thomas was an old friend who became problematic. He threatened to expose certain business arrangements that would have damaged many important people. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater good. The greater good. Sarah stepped forward, her journalist instincts overriding her fear. "You killed a man to protect your illegal mining operation. My dear girl, you understand so little about how the world works." Blackwood's tone remained patronizing, almost amused. Thomas Whitmore was going to destroy dozens of families, cost hundreds of people their livelihoods, all for the sake of his precious environmental concerns. "I simply chose the path that served the greater number." Jake felt rage building in his chest. "You're talking about my great-uncle like he was some kind of extremist. He was trying to protect these mountains. And in doing so, he would have prevented the economic development that this region desperately needs." Blackwood reached into his jacket, causing both Jake and Sarah to tense, but he only withdrew a leather checkbook. "However, I'm not here to debate ethics. I'm here to solve a problem. Name your price, Mr. Coleman. Within reason, of course." "There is no price," Jake said firmly. "Those photographs are going to the authorities." Blackwood's expression finally shifted, the false warmth draining from his features. "I was hoping you'd be more reasonable. Thomas said the same thing, you know, right up until the end." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm, ready to run, but Blackwood raised a hand in a peaceable gesture. "Please, no need for dramatics. I'm simply pointing out that stubbornness runs in your family, Mr. Coleman. But I'm confident we can reach an understanding." He glanced toward the door, and Jake realized with growing dread that they might not be leaving this building as easily as they'd entered. Outside, the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the thin walls. Blackwood's backup had arrived, and Jake suddenly understood that this meeting had never been about negotiation. It had been about eliminating the last loose ends in a murder that had taken place 30 years ago. The photographs felt heavier than ever in the satchel, as Jake realized they might have walked straight into a trap. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Jake adjusted his tie for the third time. He'd never worn a suit before, and the borrowed one from Marcus felt foreign against his skin. But today wasn't about comfort, it was about justice. Sarah squeezed his hand as they climbed the marble steps together. "You ready for this?" Jake nodded, though his stomach churned with nervous energy. Inside that building, the Pemberton family's lawyers would make their final desperate attempt to claim what was rightfully his. 3 months had passed since the discovery of the uranium deposits, and every day had brought new legal challenges, new attempts to invalidate the sale. The courthouse lobby buzzed with activity. Reporters clustered near the entrance, their cameras flashing as Jake and Sarah passed. Word had leaked about the true value of the worthless cabin, and the story had captured national attention. The media loved the narrative. Poor mountain boy outsmarts wealthy bullies through their own cruelty. "Mr. Morrison," a reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "How does it feel to go from having nothing to being worth millions overnight?" Jake paused, considering his words carefully. "I didn't have nothing before. I had dignity, and I had people who cared about me. That's worth more than any amount of money." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The Pemberton family sat at the plaintiff's table, their expensive suits and grim expressions a stark contrast to Jake's modest appearance. Richard Pemberton III refused to make eye contact, his face pale and drawn. The months of legal battles and negative publicity had taken their toll on the family's reputation and finances. Judge Helena Morrison, no relation to Jake, despite the shared surname, called the court to order. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and had little patience for frivolous lawsuits. Over the past weeks, she'd grown visibly frustrated with the Pemberton family's increasingly desperate legal maneuvers. "We're here today for final arguments in Pemberton versus Morrison," she announced. "Counselors, you may proceed." The Pemberton family's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Whitfield, rose to address the court. His argument was polished but weak. Claims of inadequate consideration, allegations of fraud, desperate assertions that the contract was unconscionable. He painted Jake as a manipulator who had somehow deceived the innocent college students. Jake watched the performance with a mixture of disgust and pity. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence of their own actions, the Pembertons couldn't accept responsibility. They'd rather paint themselves as victims than admit they'd been cruel to someone they considered beneath them. When Jake's attorney, a sharp-minded woman named Catherine Wells, stood to respond, her confidence was palpable. She methodically dismantled each of the Pemberton family's arguments, presenting the video evidence, the geological surveys, and most damaging of all, the social media posts where the college students had bragged about their hilarious prank on the pathetic mountain boy. "Your Honor," Wells concluded, "the defendants knew exactly what they were doing. They created a legally binding contract with the express purpose of humiliating my client. The fact that their cruelty backfired doesn't give them grounds to void a legitimate sale." During a brief recess, Jake stepped outside for air. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. Not just the money, though the uranium deposits were worth an estimated $47 million, but the principle of the thing. This case would send a message about consequences, about how the wealthy couldn't simply buy their way out of every mistake. Marcus found him on the courthouse steps. "How you holding up?" "Strange thing is, I almost feel sorry for them," Jake admitted. "They're so used to having everything handed to them, they can't comprehend losing." "Save your sympathy," Marcus replied firmly. "They made their choice when they decided to humiliate you for sport." Back in the courtroom, Judge Morrison delivered her verdict with crisp efficiency. She'd clearly given the matter careful consideration, but her conclusion was unambiguous. The sale was valid. The contract was enforceable. the Pemberton family's claims were without merit. Furthermore, she added, her voice carrying a note of disapproval, this court finds the plaintiff's behavior reprehensible. Using wealth and privilege to mock and humiliate others reflects poorly on their character and upbringing. The gavel fell with finality, and Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. The cabin, the land, and everything beneath it was legally, irrevocably his. As they filed out of the courtroom, Jake caught sight of Richard Pemberton III. The young man looked broken, his face a mask of defeat and disbelief. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded aisle. Jake saw no malice there anymore, only the dawning realization of consequences that would follow Richard for the rest of his life. Outside, reporters swarmed again, but Jake felt different now. The scared mountain boy who'd been mocked and humiliated was gone. In his place stood a man who'd learned that sometimes justice comes in the most unexpected packages. The helicopter's rotors churned the mountain air as it lifted off from the clearing behind the cabin, carrying Detective Morrison and 2 federal agents back to civilization. Jake watched until it disappeared beyond the ridge, then turned to survey what remained of his transformed world. The cabin sat exactly as it had 3 months ago, weathered logs and sagging porch unchanged, but everything else had shifted like pieces on a cosmic chessboard. Media vans lined the dirt road below, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sun. Reporters clustered behind yellow tape that cordoned off his property, their cameras trained on every window, waiting for him to emerge. Sarah Chen stood beside him, her tablet clutched against her chest. As his newly appointed media liaison, a role neither of them had imagined 3 days ago, she looked overwhelmed by the circus that had descended on their quiet mountain. "The Smithsonian wants to send a team next week," she said, scrolling through messages. "And there are 17 different documentary crews requesting access. CNN, BBC, National Geographic. Jake, this is unprecedented." He nodded absently, his mind still processing the morning's revelations. The federal investigation into Blackwood Industries had exploded overnight when Morrison's team uncovered additional documents in the cabin's hidden chamber. Robert Blackwood's grandfather hadn't just stolen land from Jake's family. He'd systematically acquired mineral rights across 3 counties through forged documents and intimidation, building an empire on theft that spanned generations. "What about the Blackwoods?" Jake asked. Sarah's expression darkened. "Robert's in federal custody. The charges keep multiplying. Fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder. His lawyers are scrambling, but with the evidence from the cabin..." She shrugged. "His grandfather's journal alone is enough to unravel decades of illegal land acquisitions." Jake walked to the porch railing, gripping the rough wood. Below, he could see his grandmother's garden, now trampled by investigators and reporters. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 months ago, he'd been invisible to the world, just another poor mountain kid scraping by. Now his every move was scrutinized, his family's tragic history splashed across headlines. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. "Marcus Blackwood called this morning." Jake turned, surprised. Robert's younger brother had distanced himself from the family business years ago, becoming a teacher in Oregon. "He wants to meet with you. Says he has information about other properties, other families his grandfather destroyed. He's been carrying this guilt for 20 years, Jake. The news broke something loose in him." The weight of responsibility settled heavier on Jake's shoulders. He'd thought finding the truth about his parents would bring closure, but instead, it had opened a chasm that seemed to widen with each revelation. How many families had suffered? How many stories remained buried? His phone buzzed with another call from his lawyer, the 4th that morning. The legal implications of his discovery stretched in directions he couldn't have imagined. The mineral rights alone were worth millions, but the historical significance of the documents and artifacts found in the cabin had attracted attention from institutions worldwide. "I need some air," he said, starting down the porch steps. Sarah followed. Jake, we need to make some decisions. The media won't wait forever for a statement, and there are deadlines. I know. He paused at the edge of the garden, kneeling beside a patch of wildflowers his grandmother had planted. But right now, I just need to think. The flowers were simple mountain blooms, Indian paintbrush, wild columbine, black-eyed Susan. His grandmother had chosen them because they were hardy, able to survive harsh winters and poor soil. Like his family, she'd said, like all the mountain families who'd endured when powerful men tried to break them. A memory surfaced, Robert Blackwood's sneer the day he'd bought the cabin, the casual cruelty in his voice when he'd called it a worthless shack. The irony was almost poetic. In their arrogance, the Blackwoods had handed him the very evidence that would destroy them. But revenge felt hollow now. The money, the vindication, even the justice. None of it could bring back his parents or undo 25 years of poverty and struggle. What mattered was what came next. Set up the meeting with Marcus, he said finally, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. And draft a statement for the media. Tell them I'll hold a press conference tomorrow evening. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What are you planning to say? Jake looked back at the cabin, its logs golden in the afternoon sun. Soon, historians and archaeologists would transform it into a research site, preserving every artifact, every hidden truth. But tonight, it was still just the place where his grandmother had told him stories and his mother had sung lullabies. That some things are worth more than money, he said, and that the mountains remember everything. As they walked back toward the cabin, Jake could feel the weight of generations watching him, waiting to see what he would do with the truth they died protecting. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Morrison called for order. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his weathered hands folded calmly over the thick stack of documents that would determine his fate. Across the aisle, the Whitmore family huddled with their team of expensive lawyers, their faces etched with barely concealed panic. Sarah squeezed Marcus's shoulder from the gallery behind him. "Whatever happens, you've already won," she whispered. He nodded, though his jaw remained tight with tension. The Whitmore's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Hartwell, rose first. His argument was predictable. The sale was a prank, never intended to be legally binding. The deed was signed under duress and false pretenses. His voice carried the polished confidence of someone accustomed to buying favorable outcomes. But when Marcus's attorney, Elena Rodriguez, stood to present their case, the atmosphere shifted. She was young, sharp, and had taken the case pro bono after hearing Marcus's story. Her opening statement was surgical in its precision. "Your Honor, the defendants sold property they believed worthless to my client, motivated by malice and a desire to humiliate him. The contract is ironclad, witnessed, notarized, and legally executed. The defendants cannot claim fraud simply because they failed to research what they were selling." Elena presented the evidence methodically. The original deed from 1943 showing how the military had purchased the land from the Harrison family, Marcus's great-grandfather, for a fraction of its value under eminent domain. The Environmental Protection Agency reports confirming rare earth mineral deposits worth millions. The geological surveys that had been buried in government files for decades. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. During discovery, Elena had obtained Preston Whitmore's text messages from the day of the sale. She read them aloud, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. "Let's see how the hillbilly likes his new swamp when winter comes," she quoted. "Dad will get a kick out of this when he finds out we sold that worthless land to some mountain trash." Marcus watched Preston's face crumble as his own words condemned him. The young man who had orchestrated the cruel joke now sat deflated, avoiding his father's withering stare. Elena continued building her case, calling Dr. Patricia Chen as an expert witness. The geologist explained the significance of the rare earth deposits, in terms the judge could understand. The estimated value of extractable materials from this property ranges between $12 and $15 million, she testified. The deposits are among the purest found in North America. The defense's cross-examination was desperate and ineffective. They couldn't dispute the geological evidence or explain away Preston's damning messages. Their final gambit was an appeal to sympathy, claiming the family would be ruined by losing such valuable land. Judge Morrison's expression remained impassive throughout, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around his eyes when Hartwell suggested the court should consider the disparity in social standing between the parties. During the lunch recess, Marcus stepped outside the courthouse for air. The media had caught wind of the story. Mountain Man versus Millionaires had proven irresistible to local news outlets. Reporters shouted questions, but Marcus ignored them, finding a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree. His phone buzzed with a text from Ben, watching the live stream at work. "You've got this, brother." When court reconvened, Elena delivered her closing argument with quiet passion. This case represents more than a property dispute. It's about whether wealth and privilege grant immunity from the consequences of cruelty. My client didn't seek this fight. It was brought to his doorstep by young men who thought his poverty made him a suitable target for their amusement. She gestured toward Marcus. The defendants assumed he was ignorant, that he could be easily fooled and discarded. They never imagined he might possess the dignity and determination to stand in this courtroom today, demanding justice. The defense's closing was rambling and unconvincing. Hartwell's usual Polish had abandoned him, leaving only desperate appeals to technicalities that had already been addressed. Judge Morrison called for a recess to consider his ruling. The waiting stretched endlessly, 30 minutes that felt like hours. Marcus found himself thinking not about the money, but about his great-grandfather, Harrison. The old man had lost this land to government seizure, forced to accept an insulting payment. Now, 3 generations later, justice might finally be served. When the judge returned, his voice was steady and clear. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, this court finds that the sale of the property in question was legally valid and binding. The contract will be enforced as written. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Marcus felt Sarah's hand slip into his as the gallery erupted behind them. Across the aisle, Preston Whitmore buried his face in his hands while his father stared at the ceiling in defeat. Outside, the reporters were waiting again, but this time Marcus stopped. When they asked how it felt to win, he thought carefully before answering. "It feels like coming home." The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Jake's worn boots as he waited for his lawyer to emerge from the final hearing. 3 months had passed since the discovery. 3 months of legal battles, media attention, and sleepless nights. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves, a fitting backdrop for what felt like the end of an era. Marcus Sullivan descended the steps slowly, his expensive suit wrinkled from the long day inside. Behind him trailed his father's team of lawyers, their faces grim. The once arrogant college senior looked like he'd aged years in mere months. His eyes, previously bright with cruel mischief, now held the hollow look of someone who'd lost everything. "Jake." Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper as he approached. "I wanted to talk to you before everything becomes final." Jake studied the young man who had orchestrated the cabin sale as a humiliating joke. The discovery of the hidden compartment containing rare Civil War documents, gold coins, and deed to mineral rights worth millions had transformed that cruel prank into a legal nightmare for the Sullivan family. "Go ahead," Jake said simply. Marcus swallowed hard. "I know this sounds worthless coming from me now, but I'm sorry. Not because we got caught, not because of the money. I'm sorry because we treated you like you were less than human, because we thought your poverty made you stupid, because we never saw you as a person worth respecting." The apology hung in the crisp air between them. Jake had imagined this moment countless times, had rehearsed angry speeches and cutting responses. But looking at Marcus now, broken and humbled, he felt only a weary sadness. "The cabin belonged to my great-great-grandfather," Marcus continued. "Family legend said old Josiah hid things there during the war, but we thought it was just stories. When Dad decided to sell the property for development, we saw it as a chance to have some fun with the poor kid from the mountains." "Your fun cost your family everything," Jake observed without malice. "We deserve it. Dad's construction company is bankrupt. The legal fees alone—" Marcus shook his head. "But that's not why I'm apologizing. I'm apologizing because you didn't deserve what we did to you, regardless of what was hidden in that cabin." Sarah Chen emerged from the courthouse, her camera crew following at a respectful distance. The investigative journalist who had first broken the story approached carefully, sensing the gravity of the moment. "The judge has finalized the ruling," she announced to Jake. "The Sullivan family's remaining assets will be liquidated to pay the legal judgments. The county has agreed to your proposal for the community center. It's over." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of victory mixed with an unexpected melancholy. He had won more than just money. He had proven that wealth and status couldn't simply crush the powerless. But the victory felt hollow when he looked at the destruction left in its wake. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked Marcus gently. "Start over, I guess. Dad's talking about moving west, finding work in construction again, manual labor." Marcus almost smiled at the irony. "Maybe I'll learn what real work actually feels like." The media attention had been overwhelming at first. News outlets nationwide had picked up the story of the poor mountain boy who outwitted the rich bullies, turning their joke into justice. Publishers had offered book deals, movie producers had called about film rights. Everyone wanted a piece of the modern David and Goliath tale. But Jake had learned something important about wealth during these months. Money could provide security and opportunity, but it could also corrupt and isolate. He had seen how the Sullivan family's wealth had bred arrogance and cruelty, how they had used their privilege as a weapon against those they deemed inferior. "I've been thinking about something," Jake said suddenly, surprising everyone present. "The cabin still needs restoration work. The foundation is solid, but the roof, the walls, the interior, it all needs professional attention." Marcus looked confused. "Okay? I'm planning to hire a construction crew for the project. If you're serious about learning real work, about starting over, there might be a place for you. It wouldn't be charity, you'd earn every dollar. But it would be honest work." The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Marcus stared at Jake in disbelief, his eyes filling with tears he tried to hide. "Why would you do that? After everything?" Jake thought of his grandfather's words about the mountains teaching patience and forgiveness to those willing to listen. Because somebody has to break the cycle. Because revenge might feel good, but it doesn't heal anything. And because that cabin taught me something about hidden treasures, sometimes the most valuable thing you can find is the chance to become better than you were. As the sun set behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps, Jake felt the weight of the past 3 months beginning to lift. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about how to use his unexpected fortune responsibly. The mountain air was crisp as Jake walked the familiar trail one last time before the changes would begin. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the college quad, and the weight of what lay ahead pressed gently on his shoulders. Behind him, the sounds of construction crews echoed through the valley as they prepared the land for the educational center that would bear his grandmother's name. Marcus fell into step beside him, no longer the arrogant rich boy who had orchestrated the cruel prank. The humility that had replaced his former swagger suited him better, Jake thought. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the activity below. "More sure than I've ever been about anything," Jake replied. his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had grown within him over these months of transformation. She always said, education was the one thing nobody could take away from you. The legal battles were finally over. Brandon's father had tried every maneuver his expensive lawyers could devise, but the evidence was overwhelming. The mining rights, the land deeds, even the original survey maps, everything had been legitimate and properly filed decades ago. The Harrington family's attempts to claim fraud had crumbled under scrutiny, leaving them to face the reality that their son's prank had cost them more than just money. Chloe emerged from the cabin carrying a box of the last remaining artifacts they'd catalogued. Her transformation had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. The superficial socialite had discovered a passion for historical preservation that surprised everyone, including herself. The museum curator says these letters from your great-grandfather could be worth displaying, she said, carefully setting the box down. The way he describes the mining techniques of that era, it's fascinating. Jake smiled, remembering how she'd spent weeks poring over every document they'd found, treating each piece of family history with reverence. He'd have liked knowing someone appreciated his work. The fortune they'd discovered had been staggering in its scope. The rare earth minerals beneath the mountain were valued in the tens of millions, but Jake had made his decision early on. Half would fund the educational center and scholarship program. Another portion would establish a trust for the mountain families who had struggled for generations. The remainder would ensure his own family's security while allowing him to pursue the environmental law degree that had become his new passion. Sarah Chen appeared on the ridge, her survey equipment gleaming in the afternoon sun. She'd been instrumental in the sustainable development plan that would extract the minerals while preserving the mountain's ecological integrity. The final environmental impact assessment is clean, she called out. Your grandmother would be proud of how you're handling this. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. What began as a vicious prank designed to humiliate had become the catalyst for something meaningful. Jake had insisted that Marcus, Chloe, and even Brandon, despite his ongoing legal troubles, be part of the solution. Community service at the center, scholarship funding from their families, and genuine efforts to bridge the gap between their worlds. Professor Williams approached from the cabin, carrying his laptop bag. He'd taken a sabbatical to help design the curriculum for the center. I've been thinking about what you said regarding the scholarship selection process, he said to Jake. Prioritizing need over privilege. It's going to change lives. That's the point, Jake replied, looking out over the valley where he'd grown up. Soon, it would host students from across the region. Kids like him who had the hunger to learn but lacked the resources. The dormitories were already taking shape, designed to blend with the natural landscape rather than dominate it. Marcus cleared his throat, something he'd been wanting to say for weeks, finally finding voice. I know I can't undo what we did, what I led. But watching what you've built from our stupidity, it's taught me more than 4 years of college ever could. Jake studied his former tormentor, seeing genuine remorse and growth in his eyes. Sometimes the best lessons come from the worst mistakes, he said simply. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the small group gathered around the cabin one last time. Tomorrow, it would be relocated to the center's campus, preserved as a testament to the family that had called this mountain home for generations. Chloe pulled out her phone and hesitated. Would it be weird if we took a picture? Not for social media or anything, just to remember. Jake nodded, and they arranged themselves naturally around the old structure. No posing, no artificial smiles, just 5 people whose lives had been irrevocably changed by a single act of cruelty that had somehow transformed into something beautiful. The flash captured more than their faces. It froze a moment of redemption, of growth, of the mysterious ways that life could turn pain into purpose. As they walked down the mountain together, Jake carried with him his grandmother's words. Sometimes, child, what looks like an ending is really just a beginning wearing a disguise.